Today I'm here with James Bender. James, how are you?
Fine, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great.
Great.
Let's talk about REST.
REST,
What is
okay. Well, REST basically stands for Representational State Transfer. And people are talking about it being the new hotness. And really, it's not that new. It's been around for 20 years. So if you've looked at a web page in 20 years, you've used REST. And basically, the idea behind REST, and I'm going to talk about this mostly in terms of web services because that's the world I live in. It's this idea of accessing resources on the internet based on a URI or an address.
Okay, and I do that all the time. Navigate to a page.
We do it all the time, navigate to a page, right. And we kind of got away in the .NET world from RESTful working when we got into the idea of web forms and trying to create that page lifecycle. We kind of hid away a lot of that stuff. And then even with on the web services side, we got into things like SOAP. We kind of got away from some of the REST stuff. It got very heavy, very enterprisey. And I want to say right now, I like REST, I'm a big fan of REST. SOAP's not going to go away though, because there's still a lot of things you can do in SOAP that you really just can't do in REST. These are things.
Let's define so SOAP is a Simple Object Access Protocol.
It stands for, yes, it was.
What is that? How is that different from REST?
It's very similar to an RPC call. In fact, that's what SOAP was originally used for. Yeah, our remote procedure call. In fact, that's initially what SOAP was used for, was to make these remote procedure calls on from one machine to another. And it kind of got repurposed in this idea of making it a web service language because it's text-based XML, and it's very interoperable, and it's very extensible. And because I was mentioning, a big reason it's not going to go away anytime soon is there's a lot of things that enterprises care about that you can do in SOAP, things like transactions.
Okay.
Obviously, financial institutions, you don't want to accidentally pay your electric bill 3 times.
Right.
So it's very important to have that for a lot of those things. Now, having said that, those actually turn out to be kind of a small segment of what's going on with web services. So really, there's moved back towards REST because it's lightweight, it's easier to understand, it's very ubiquitous, and it's easy to work with. Whereas SOAP, you have to kind of not really break the internet model, but you kind of got to tweak things a little bit. Okay. There's a concept of REST verbs. If you've worked in ASP Classic, you've heard of these get, post. There's also put, delete, and head. SOAP-based web services really only understand post. Okay. So all these other verbs you're missing out on. And really it's those verbs that help define the interface of your service when you're using REST. Get is for obviously getting information. I just want to see a customer.
Let me just back up 1 second here.
Okay.
If I understood you correctly, we're talking really about using REST versus using SOAP for this remote procedure call functionality, calling something from one computer to another computer.
Right.
And the SOAP, although it has some advantages like transactional support and all the WS star things that are defined as part of the spec, it also adds a lot of complexity that most people are not using.
Right, and you mentioned RPC, and it's a very important thing to make. SOAP web services kind of got into that our remote procedure call mindset. You would call service and you'd employ workflows and things like that. REST is kind of, I don't want to say it's anti-RPC, but REST is more about not workflows. It's more about there's a resource somewhere. It could be text, it could be a PDF, it could be a media file. I don't really care. All right. But there's a resource somewhere and I want to access it. I don't necessarily want to launch a workflow. I just want to get to this thing that's out there.
So I need a paradigm shift. I start thinking about REST. SOAP, when I think about SOAP, I'm thinking like I'm telling another computer, run a program and give me the results. That's sort of the paradigm that I think of in my head. And you're saying that REST, you really shouldn't think of it that way. Well, you should think about there's some resource over there, get that resource, return it to me.
Right, and that's not to say you can't cause REST services to start workflows. It's not really necessarily a good idea.
Okay.
But you could have your the rest is just your interface to your service. The service on the other side of that interface layer, they can do anything it wants.
Okay.
Having said that, it's not something you should really do.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry to go. You were talking about the verbs.
The verbs. So that kind of is really what's defining what your API is. You have that URI, which directs you to a resource, and then you have your verbs, which define how you're going to interact with that resource. Okay. Get something in a read-only. Say we're accessing a person database. Get will return the person to us in a way we can't edit. Post gets overused and abused a little bit. Traditionally, or I guess from an orthodox standpoint, it's supposed to be used only for putting new instances of a resource out there. You create a person, you post that person. a lot of people start using put for things like that. Put's really, generally speaking, for the update. I've created a person, now it's a customer, say they've moved, I need to change the address, put the new information up there. Delete obviously deletes a person from a resource from the store. If it's a person, gets rid of them. Head is something that doesn't get used very much. It's really about bringing back the metadata to describe what that resource is. It does. You don't see it get used very often, but it is out there. So if you encounter it, that's all that is.
Okay. So how do I, as a .NET developer, use REST? How do I develop it and consume it?
Well, there's two ways, and both are very good, and both have strengths and weaknesses. If you're using ASP.NET right now, you're already kind of using REST, because when you think about how MVC works, that's really what the interface is. You have a URI to a page, and part of that address is your controller, which is the controller class, obviously. And then the next part of that URI could be your action, log in, get account, whatever. And then you can either, depending upon how you want to do it, you can make the ID, which you want to look up, part of the query string, or you can make it part of the URI. But if you look at how the routes work in ASP.NET MVC, it's actually a very RESTful interface for web pages. So it's gone really kind of the opposite direction from where web forms was going.
Okay.
A lot of people contend that web forms broke the internet. I'm not going to. That's a religious discussion. I'm not going to get into.
The internet, you said?
That's what people say.
What's your
Rachel
opinion?
Appel.
What do you mean? What do they mean when they say broke that?
Well, because the idea of the internet was supposed to be it's a stateless network of resources, and you
Okay.
get to need
Sure.
resources.
And posting in a lot of ways is a way to get around that.
Well, and this
Postbacks.
whole idea of having postbacks, having this idea of a page life cycle and trying to make it more like win forms. I don't know that one's better than the other. I prefer MVC. That's just kind of the way I work. Rachel Appel has a lot of really great thoughts on why they're both good and why they both have value. So definitely check out her blog, email her, follow her on Twitter. I do too, and you all should as well. So that's one way, and you can create these actions on your controllers as REST services. So it doesn't have to return HTML to you. We can return JSON, and you can hit it with a browser or with Fiddler and work with it that way. And that's if you're already using ASP.NET MVC, that's a very low friction way to bring REST web services into your application. The other side of it is WCF 3.5 has REST services built in. It's a little more friction. There's more kind of sharp things to poke yourself with doing it that way. It's not as low friction as MVC, but if you're not using MVC, or if you need some sort of functionality that MVC doesn't easily provide, it's a great way to do it. I've been going around showing a lot of people how to get REST up and running in MVC, or rather in WCF right now. And that's a good way to do it as well.
What are the steps in using WCF? WCF is a framework that allows you to, without writing a lot of code, deliver services in with a lot of different transports and a lot of different formats.
Right.
So people use it to deliver remoting, they use it to deliver SOAP web services, they use it to deliver apparently RESTful web services as well.
Sure.
What's the process of using WCF to build a RESTful web service?
Well, traditionally with WCF, what you would do is you create your service contract, and that would define your service, and you'd have it basically be an interface.
Use what?
You basically use an interface,
Okay.
like customer service system, and you decorate that with a service contract attribute, and you could set some attributes on that like namespace and things like that. And then within that interface, you'd have your method names, and you'd apply operation contract attributes to those. And then that would basically be your service interface. That's how your service gets identified to the outside world. You'd implement that in a class, write your logic, and when you expose that service out, it would use the service and operation contracts in that interface to tell the outside world, hey, this is how I talk, this is how I communicate, this is how you can interact with me, and vice versa. These are the contracts I support. When you start moving into the REST stuff in 3.5, there's a few more steps you have to take. There's an additional attribute you have to decorate your operations with. There is the web get attribute, which if you put that on operation, it's going to support the get verb.
Okay.
There's a web invoke attribute where you can specify which verb you want to use. So if you want to use anything other than get, use web invoke, and then you specify post or delete or put or whatever. And you can even use that to do gets.
Okay.
So that's the first thing you have to do.
And this is on the interface.
This is on the service contract, yes.
Okay.
The interface. The next thing you have to do is in your configuration file. WCF works with bindings, and it supports a lot of different bindings. If you want to do web HTTP, if you want to do WS star based HTTP, if you want to do TCP name pipes, you just change the binding element in the configuration. WCF works with endpoints. An endpoint consists of at least an address, which is where your service lives, the binding, how it talks back and forth, and the contract, which is this is what's available on this endpoint. What you need to do is change that binding to use the web HTTP binding to tell WCF, okay, this is going to be a little different than what you've been doing. Instead of packaging all this as a SOAP message and encoding it and sending it out, I need you now to send it out as either POX, which POX stands for plain old XML, or JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So the way it's kind of implemented in .NET 3.5 is it's not a core part of the framework that most people would think it to be. It's really implemented by adding on some behaviors, because that's what the web attribute.
Those are what the attributes are. They're adding behaviors.
They're adding behaviors to your operations.
Okay.
And through a series of changes to the channel stack. The channel is how WCF communicates with the outside world. It's a series of encoders and serializers and things like that. And also changing that channel stack with the binding to say, hey, instead of turning this into XML or SOAP, turn it into either POX or JSON, depending upon what I've specified. And you can specify that in your operation contract. Mm-hmm. You can specify that through some other behaviors and configuration. There is a way to set it up where your client calling you can specify, I want JSON or I want POX, and have them decide how to get it back.
Okay, so is WCF the best approach for creating
well, it depends.
a web service?
It depends.
It always depends.
I know, I'm an architect. That's why I ought to have it tattooed on my forehead, actually. If you're already using the MVC framework for an application you're building,
okay,
and these services are going to be things you're using in an application. For instance, maybe you're doing an AJAX call to a backend service to get a JSON object back. You're probably better off just implementing your REST service as a method on that controller and calling it that way. It's going to be less friction. It's all going to be one place.
Okay.
It's really page logic anyway, so it makes sense to kind of keep it with the rest of that page logic.
Yeah, okay.
On the other side, if you're not using ASP.MVC, and a lot of places still aren't.
Oh, most places are not, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's we live in this kind of bubble where we think everybody's doing all the cool stuff, and the reality is, no, they're still using.
No, the reality is that I am not doing all the cool stuff that I want to do.
Well, nobody is. I mean, everybody's always looking for the next cool thing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of places still using .NET too.
Sure.
So that's an issue as well. But if you're lucky enough to be using .NET 3.5, but not using MVC, or it's something that you don't want to put in part of your presentation layer, or it's something that needs to be cross-application, or it's something you need to maybe have more control over how the service works. Okay. WCF is going to be the way to go.
Okay, and I think the advantage is because WCF takes care of things like creating the JSON output or creating the XML output or a lot of the plumbing involved with that.
A lot of that, a lot of how messages are wrapped.
Okay.
You really get into it. And if you think of it this way, the MVC approach is driving a car with an automatic transmission, and the MVC is a manual transmission.
Okay. So if you need more control over it.
If you need more control over it, MVC's or WCF is the way to go.
Okay.
So
what if the only thing I know about REST is what I've learned in the last few minutes talking to you? Where's the good
You're in big trouble.
No. I know I'm in big trouble. I'm way behind, right? So where would I go to start? What can I start learning about?
Well, I just so happen to have a couple of books with me because I always travel. When you travel a lot, you never know when you're going to get stuck in a hotel or whatever, so you learn to bring a ton of books with you. One of them, if you just want to learn the basics of REST, specifically with .NET, this book, RESTful.NET by John Flanders from O'Reilly. This is a really good book, very easy to understand. It's very short. I've actually managed to read this on like one plane flight.
Great.
So that's a good book to get you started. If you really want to get from the WCF point of view, and this is probably one of my go-to WCF books just in general. It's a book by a bunch of guys from Microsoft. I'm not going to go on all their names, but Essential WCF for .NET 3. This is kind of my, you can see it's very dog-eared and beaten up. It's been all over the country.
This is also a reference book for you.
It's a reference book for me if I need to go back and look at something, but this doesn't just cover REST. This covers everything soup to nuts.NET or WCF, client server, behaviors, channels, bindings, you name it, security, how to read those god-awful traces you get out of WCF that look like the computer just barfed into a text file. This tells you how to do it. This is the best, $40 I've ever spent.
Alright, so I like the barf analogy. It's better than
Oh, that's what it
the
looks
dump
like.
analogy.
It's funny because it's all XML based, but if you try to load an XML notepad, it is not well-formed XML, so you have to
Oh,
use
really?
their utility, which is nice, but yeah, it's not well-formed XML because there's no open and close tag for the document.
Ah. Oh, so there's more than one root element.
There's more than one root element, and when you
Okay.
think about it, since it's a trace, you don't really know when you're going to be done, so you can't really do
I
read
thought that all
element.
XML was by definition well-formed XML. I guess that's not true.
No, no, that's not you.
That's another show.
I have seen some very, very malformed XML.
Oh, I just thought then you couldn't call it XML. Maybe I'm wrong.
Potato. I'm sure somebody out there is going to run out to the patent office and patent XML any day now. And we'll all be screwed.
Cool. I'd love that lawsuit.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Not much. WCF 4.0 is coming out. I'm doing some looking into that.
Okay, great.
But that's pretty much it from the WCF side. Some other things I'm looking at on the horizon are Ruby and iPhone development. So.
Okay, and plug your architecture organization.
I'm also the senior editor for first-party content of n+1.org. That's an architecture. It's a site for architects, and we're also kind of skewing towards lead developer types as well. I run it with Mike Wood out of Cincinnati and Chris Woodruff out of Grand Rapids. n+1.org. You've written an article for us. We'll be getting that up pretty soon. It's got a lot of great first-party content. It's got a lot of great kind of aggregate third-party content. And we're doing these architecture events all around the Midwest. We're kind of spiraling out. Now we're looking at hitting Chicago and Indianapolis and somewhere in Pennsylvania this year. We haven't figured out where in Pennsylvania, but the plan is just kind of start in Ohio. We're going to hopefully spiral out around the country eventually.
Right.
So I might be coming to a town near you soon.
James, thanks a lot.
Always a pleasure,
Learned
Dave.
a lot. Appreciate that.
Thanks. Technology is a great way to make a lot of good friends.